in some way the time was just right for this.
This was here where it culminated for us. I really didn't realize how vast it was.
Such new possibilities for warfare had opened.
It all got right out of this field of grass right here in O'Neill, Nebraska.
Enter Dr. Heinz Littau and Gunther Lozier. Heinz Littau is a turbulence expert and worked on the Great Plains Turbulence Field Project with Gunther Lozier, a ballistics expert and inventor of the Lozier method. Both men were men of science, and both men were prisoners of war during World War II. Both of them came to America during Project Paperclip. This meant that both men were German scientists that were recruited to move to America. As time would later pass, both men would be assigned to the turbulence tests that would help America in a way that had never been done before.
Both men were seen as what you might call guests in America. They both worked on the infamous German rocket program and were captured during World War II. The two scientists would later embark on a scientific series of tests that would be lost to time, but not forgotten by the people of small-town O'Neill, Nebraska. The men would need a large, somewhat flat area, much like this one, but on a much larger scale.
And so we will enter into the small town, much like the ones you've ideally read about, of O'Neill, Nebraska, where everyone knows each other and everyone knows what's going on. And on the outskirts of town, the space they would need would be given to them.
As only time will tell, Dr. Lozier has long since passed. The German scientists would be lost along with 6 other pilots in a catastrophic helicopter crash that would make the obituary number of the local newspaper jump. The scientist and his partner, Heinz Littau, both worked on the V-2 rocket testing and were the ideal people to be working on the tests. The main goal of the project would be to see how to shoot a missile and have it land on a target, making its kill. As the test would continue, the town would become overwhelmed with the fact that the Air Force was currently using their little home and would become infatuated with curiosity. But this is not the story of the town or the Air Force. This is the very true account of 2 German scientists who would make their mark in America. The location is literally in the name, the Great Plains Turbulence Field Test. If you take a 3-hour drive outside the bustling city of Omaha, you reach the Irish capital of O'Neill, Nebraska. And if you drive out of town, you're met with nothing but wide open spaces and possibly a few cows. What might seem disgusting or boring to our technology-crazed youth was seen as a gift to Lozier and Littau. As the Air Force drove throughout the town might have expected the worst until after the Air Force and the 2 scientists were there to stay and were seen as friendly faces throughout the town.
For the tests to work, the group needed a flat, uniform area with a constant wind. They knew it would end up somewhere in the central area of the United States, most likely the Great Plains. The search ended as they found what they were looking for: a large, flat, and uniform plain with a constant southern breeze. With no water sprinklers or windmills in their way,
The test would later go on to use the Lozier technique.
It involved using the prime of military technology at the time, the H-18 helicopter. This would drop racks of chemical packs that would each disperse by a timed explosion. At night, weather balloons were released into the air in hope it would give them an ideal picture of the wind's movement.
Along comes the tragedy. During a regulated flight check with the H-18 helicopter, the helicopter had finally arrived after 3.5 days. During a routine flight check, the pilot took his crew up. The helicopter was not used to having so many people on board and began to stall. The men expected the worst as the rotor began to cut off the tail section. The pilot and his crew were lost in the crash, and Dr. Lozier was lost in the fire.
And sadly, the tests would continue on without Lozier and his crew. The tests were necessary for military development. This tragedy would change the design of helicopters our troops would use in Vietnam. Littau and crew were sent another helicopter and began testing on schedule, but of course, using the Lozier technique.
As the Air Force began to settle into the little town, Lozier and Littau would both make trips to the 2 local newspapers. This would prepare the townsfolk for what would be happening in the next year. The Chamber of Commerce would post an ad for the increasing need for housing as the new troops began to come into town. One ad found was posted by the Chamber of Commerce in the Holt County Independent. The number of troops at that time was 100.
As the test started, the people of the town would begin to become very interested in what was happening just outside their safe haven. Much equipment would be to be donated to the project. A computer was donated. It filled an entire building. Some of the equipment used to measure wind, like an anemometer, was just ping pong balls cut in half.
Sensors on 15-foot towers monitored the site. As the test began, the lights that lit up the field at night would be described as looking like a prairie fire. Although Lozier was not there to see his project come to a success, it was obvious that he would be proud not only of the test, but of Latow, the crew, and the town of O'Neill, Nebraska.
The town was overwhelmed, and people began to appear at the testing site. The people on site would begin to set up stations that would explain what was being done in the area so close to their home. This test was necessary for military success and would begin a new era of military technology, including guided missiles, and even changed the design of the H-18 so that our troops in Vietnam would survive long flights without a fatal accident. Lozier and Latow have both passed on. The two scientists will be remembered throughout history. Dr. Lozier had his life cut short in a helicopter crash, but Latow lived a long life. Dr. Heinz Latow passed away about a week after an interview with Dave Manoucheri. As the time of death varies between the scientists, there is no doubt that they had the same determination to better mankind. Both men were seen as equal in each other's eyes and will live on in the history of our great nation.
There we go. So, in the Great Plains Turbulence Field Project, what was exactly like the need for the tests?
Well, they didn't know how the air moved from the ground a mile up. They knew there was a jet stream way up high, but they had no idea how the air moved. That's why when the Germans launched V-2 rockets on England, they never knew where they were going to land. They could go too far, they could go too short because they relied on the prevailing winds, but they didn't know how the prevailing winds worked. So the project was created by the U.S. government to figure out how the air moved, because at the end of the day, they wanted to launch a guided missile at Moscow. And if they were going to hit Moscow, they wanted to be able to hit Moscow. So if the wind went the wrong direction, going from the United States to Russia, it could carry it off course any number of directions, and it would miss the target altogether.
So why did they choose Lozier and Latow to do this project?
Latow was chosen because he had done turbulence testing under the V-2 program for Germany, which was, the V-2 was a rocket that was designed by Wernher von Braun, the man who's founded NASA. And the V-2 rockets were basically, they called them flying vacuum cleaners in England because they sounded like a bunch of puttering things as they went over. But Latow was a man who knew about turbulence. He had studied it in the German Weather Bureau. He had this, and so he worked for a division called the Geophysics Research Directorate that worked on meteorology. And so he was chosen because he had the most knowledge in terms of turbulence. Lozier was chosen because he was a ballistics expert. He worked on the V-2 project as well. And because he knew sort of the ideas of how to do ballistics and how to deal with trying to get a chart in the air of how the air moved, he was chosen by Heinz Latow, who's the leader of the project, to be one of the key scientists in it.
And what was it like getting to talk to Dr. Latow?
He was interesting. He made me do homework. Before he would do an interview, he wanted to make sure that I was smart enough and would understand the stuff, so he gave me homework to do, which was actually really hard. But he was a fascinating guy. He was brilliant. He had an amazing story. He didn't want to be a Nazi. He was conscripted into the army. He had been captured by the U.S. government during the war and was a POW and was saved from the POW camps by Jewish scientists that he had worked for in Germany. He came and left his home in Germany and came to the United States to become a scientist. He was a brilliant man, a very soft-spoken man, and he seemed humbled by the fact that somebody was going to come and talk to him about his project, which was really nice. But he was a fascinating man and a brilliant man, and it was a privilege to meet him.
And what was Project Paperclip?
Project Paperclip was a project created by the U.S. government. When the war in Europe had ended, the U.S. and the Russians both decided they wanted to scoop up as many German scientists as they could. The Russians weren't doing it so subtly. They were capturing people and taking them prisoner. The U.S. government created what they called Project Paperclip, which is what you'd think, paper pushers, scientists, people who wrote on stuff and clipped it together. So they created this project where they recruited all these scientists. They would get them jobs. They would bring them to the United States, and they would create a job for them. And Heinz Latow was one of the paper clippers, they called it. He was a Project Paperclip guy who came to the United States, paid for by the U.S. government, Given a job, he worked on the East Coast for the Geophysics Research Directorate. The biggest group of scientists that came under paperclip, though, were the scientists and the crew that had worked on the V2 rocket program with Wernher von Braun. He, during the war, had basically conscripted a train, took it over, and drove the train to the U.S. front and gave himself and his crew up, and they ended up joining Project Paperclip, and they became sort of the founding members of NASA.
And so, when the helicopter crash took Lozer's life, did anyone come to claim his body?
He had family, yes, absolutely, and he had family. He was married. He had kids. His son was there and saw the chopper crash. So his wife was there. So is his son, his family. All the scientists had brought their families with them, or at least a lot of them did, and they lived there for the month, either in the house or in the hotel or whatever with the scientists. So my understanding was his oldest son was there on the field when the chopper went down, and when the 50th anniversary of the test happened, his oldest son wouldn't go. His youngest son, Helmut, did. So yeah, his wife was there to claim the body.
And then, how old was Latow when he died?
Latow was in his, I want to say he was close to 90, maybe past 90. He was in his 80s when I interviewed him. I didn't know this, but he passed away not long after I interviewed him, so it was just a few short months after I talked with him. So the piece that aired on Nebraska Public Television aired, and he never saw it. Which was sad for me because I wanted him to know that his legacy was remembered. But he had a full life. I mean, any one of the activities he'd done. I mean, he did turbulence testing on the African steppe. He worked for the German Weather Bureau. He came back to Germany on the night of Kristallnacht, which was the night that they gathered up all the Jews and started taking him prisoner. It made him very sad to see Germany sort of degrade itself that way and fall apart. To be captured and held prisoner and become a scientist and be part of what would become the nuclear age and push it forward, and then be part of a test that would spawn and help propel us into space, into the moon. What an amazing life.
I wanted to say thank you for giving us a lot of our key information for our documentary. This was actually really cool getting to talk to you about this. Thank you for your time.